So I'm going to be presenting my book here today, Mao and Markets, co-authored with a former student of mine, Kunyuan Qiao, who is now at Georgetown University, graduated with a PhD from Cornell. Okay, so another technical thing. I think it probably just needs to be okay, super. Yeah. Okay. All right. So many of you have probably seen this graph or graph similar. And it's really in many ways the motivation for my talk in the book that we did. And actually the book that we wrote is actually based on a number of peer-reviewed academic articles. So, you know, these articles, they're mostly quantitative. So, you know, we get these large databases and do some analyses and, go through peer review and it gets published. For the book, what we are trying to do is take a step back a bit and sort of ground sort of the findings that we've had a little bit more historically, as well as with some sort of real life case study examples. And also, we did interviews with a lot of entrepreneurs because what we're going to be looking at is, this really incredible economic miracle in China over the past, 40 years since reform and opening. This growth rate of about 10% over this time period is really unprecedented in world history. While at the same time in the West, and I've spent most of my life in the U.S., so I'll sort of mainly comment on the U.S. I'm not sure, the UK, this might not follow as much, but there, if you look in the media, if you listen to politicians, sort of the discourse around sort of the fragility and sort of non-economic focus of China, communism lumped in with the USSR and then later Russia, really creates a disconnect that I think has actually clouded a lot of the policy making and also business, business decisions and entry into China. One of the motivations or one of the sort of early experiences I had in China when I first started spending a reasonable amount of time in the country was I entered the office of the CEO of Costco, one of the largest companies in the world, large shipping company, named Wei Jiafu or Fu Weijia, and he had done an amazing job actually of orienting Costco to the West. As a shipping company, obviously you want to be a very international company. They operated ports in Boston and Long Beach. He spoke very exceptionally good English, was a signatory of the UN Global Compact, which was, this international effort to try to have more sort of social responsibility business. And so I walk into his office and sort of greeting you is a life-size statue of Mao. My background, I'm not like, probably many or all of you, a traditional, China scholar. My PhD is in sociology and more general sort of economic and organizational sociology, which is why, for most of my time I've taught at business school. A lot of the work that I do looks at environmental issues, civil society, social impact. And around, 2009, 2010, I really began dedicating, my time to spending time in China, researching those issues, and spent, over the 10 years from 2010 to 2020, about 4 years in China, and a lot of time, sort of doing, various research, interviews. Spent a lot of time learning Chinese too. Don't recommend when you're 40 starting to learn Chinese. So I was relatively early in my sort of time in China when I visited, Captain Wei, because he's the head of shipping company, I like to be called Captain. And yes, just thought, okay, this idea of sort of having a Mao statue and also the flag of the China, 5-star flag, and also the flag of the CCP was right there, sort of with big flags. And I thought, yeah, maybe this is just, what you need to do. It's a state-owned company. And I think a lot of people in the West have thought that, the displays towards the CCP, towards communism, are just that, displays. I recently was reading an article in Foreign Affairs by someone who is, seen as one of the best or most well-known China observers. And he said, after the 20th Party Congress, things have changed dramatically. Before then, the officials that he interacted with would sort of, talk about, sort of the Maoist Marxist rhetoric and sort of give you a little wink. He said, that this was just their, again, sort of display. And I think that's actually a little bit of a naive way to think about things. And that's in many ways what we're going to try to, sort of what we try to unpack in the book, and I'll talk a little bit about here today, is that the sort of longstanding socialization, institutions, elements of society and culture that have been sort of introduced into China in the post-49 period have a deep influence actually on people and institutions there, and it shows up in many ways in the business, in some expected, some unexpected ways. So I'll keep going. So I think that when we wrote our book and some of the articles, the idea that that guided a lot of U.S. policy. You see here Bill Clinton, talking about China's entry in the WTO in 2001. This is, like a one-way street. Many well-known and sort of savvy observers, thought this was the case, that actually by introducing markets, that China would politically liberalize as well. In this, I think, it's too bad our book didn't come out a little earlier. I think it would, now I think this is pretty debunked. Another, I think, issue that particularly in the media in the US is that the systems of China and the USSR are very similar, and the USSR collapsed, therefore China will collapse. And that, sort of this coming China collapse phenomena, and that there's the idea that, communism is very brittle. So I'll say a little bit about that the China in relation to the in relation to the USSR as well, and also just the idea that the Chinese government's flexible. I think that Deng Xiaoping, sort of folksy guy, goes to Houston and wears a cowboy hat and has very insightful, I think, sayings like, doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, it matters is if it catches the mouse. And, and I think one of the things that I think is actually pretty insightful as well is the idea of, the market and plan are actually just tools. And I think that, this is something that I'll say in a bit. The West, I think we have trouble, at least in the US in particular, really very much separate the market and state in ways cognitively that I think makes it difficult to understand China. So, okay. So I think sort of understanding the sort of enduring role of the CCP in the economy, in politics and society is more important now than ever. I mean, you have, as you can see, from the 20th Party Congress, well discussed Xi Jinping's sort of stacking the Standing Committee with loyalists. More recently, Leo, and a lot of crackdowns on people like Jack Ma, many other companies. And then you see more recently, I think, running into economic problems with the sort of COVID opening, creating a lot of disruption. Leo at Davos talking about how China is going to be open for business, basically. So I mean, it's interesting to think about. I mean, I think again, not to sort of characterize the West as the US. I mean, I talk to a lot of US companies that do business in China, and I think that has been covered so extensively in the media. That many companies are sort of salivating, basically, literally. But I mean, I think that we should really not be so convinced by one few speech with a few sentences someone a senior leader says at a World Economic gathering, but actually, think a bit more about the underlying system. Okay. Let me look. I want to make sure questions are the most interesting part of this, so I'm going to try to speed up a bit. One of the things that in this group, this presentation I give to sort of more general audiences. So you probably, I'm sure all of you are familiar with what I'm going to show here, but I am still going to show it because, so my background is in sort of more general social science, not China studies specifically, and in my both earlier publishing and early doctoral work, studied a lot of psychology and sociology. My degree is in sociology, and there is a rich set of literature in cross-cultural psychology around how the cognitive frames differ between the East and the West. And so in the East, dating back to Aristotle and others, there's this idea that we sort of separate and categorize. And I don't want to go way too, this is generalized way too much, but there are a lot of studies that look at even how parents socialize their children, as an example. They sort of focus, in the West, in the US, playing with toys, focus on the differences between them, grouping them. Whereas in the East, things are much more relational and about sort of handling contradictions. And so this is the thing that I think that most Westerners actually, again, I think this group probably accepted, sort of don't fully grasp that, it's not like the state and market are separate institutions, but they're actually both subsidiary of the CCP. And so, anyways, even the military, one of Xi Jinping's three titles is the head of the military. So anyway, so I think that as my experience as a newcomer to China 10, 12 years ago, trying to understand why someone like Wei Jiafu would have a statue of Mao, I think this starts to get at a bit. Secondly, yeah, I'll stop there. Okay, so an overview of the book. So what we try to do, and again, we base this on a number of the peer-reviewed studies I've been doing over the past, since maybe 2015 is when we started to get those published, around how sort of the socialization process of business leaders into the CCP influences their later organizational and business strategies. This is something that, we look at that because in some ways it's sort of a contradiction. This gentleman here, before we got started, said Mao and markets, those don't go together. And so, this is, one in some ways why we think this is, interesting thing to study, because, in theory, these should be sort of like, oil and water. Also, this, again, in the West, that we've really thought that there's this economic theory that, China is going to be opening up politically because it's opened up democratically, or excuse me, opened up in its markets, and then finally try to develop some principles of sort of understanding. Okay. Another sort of piece of theory, in addition to the cross-cultural psychology I mentioned, that we draw on a bit is as imprinting theory. You're probably familiar with Konrad Lorenz, a Nobel Prize winning bioecologist that had geese following around. I won't go into why that is. If you don't know, you can Google it. There's actually, from economics, sociology, psychology, a set of literature that also looks at sort of early leaders and how they actually end up influencing the society in long-standing ways. And so this is some of the more general theory, looking at how in early U.S., Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton have a lasting effect. France, there's some studies as well. Okay, so why would this be the case that early leaders or early systems end up having an enduring influence? So I'm going to discuss a couple things about Chinese, socialization processes, and then secondly about institutions. So, so first of all, about 100 million people are CCP members. They've gone through the process of joining the CCP from, attending a variety of meetings, watching documentaries, writing reports, reading a variety of sort of different speeches and journals, and having a mentor. And so this is a process ongoing, year plus. And it happens actually, interestingly, when there is, and psychology discusses how these key age transition time periods end up having a lasting influence. I don't know if, sort of a funny example of this that just popped into my mind. I mean, like the music that I like actually is music when I was like in my late teens or early 20s. I don't know if anyone else has that. Maybe many people are still in their in that age range, but this is actually studied a bit too about how these key periods, and so people are, the CCP members at least are going through this socialization process. However, this is not something that just applies to CCP members. If you go throughout educational system in China, people are taking classes on Maoism, taking classes on Marxist-Leninist as required classes. Another sort of little anecdote that sort of spurred some of my my interest in studying this is when I was at Cornell, I was on a PhD admissions panel, and I was scrolling through this was maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, scrolling through someone's transcripts and application file, and saw the Chinese term Mao Zedong Sishang on their transcript, and I'm like, that's interesting. And I looked actually, and so I mean, I think probably everyone speaks Chinese, but sort of like Maoism, basically Mao thought, Mao Zedong thought, and so so I looked on the English translation of that because the school provides a certified English translation as well, and it was described as Chinese philosophy, actually. So this was interesting to me, and I looked at it's interesting because all the students that were applying in the PhD program in their colleges, if they went to a Chinese college, took mandatory required classes in Mao thought up through college. I mean, so and the translations were varied. So the Chinese philosophy one was not, some of them actually reported the exact words, but that was sort of an interesting. So anyway, so these are things that are enduring, sort of transmitted through education, through culture, sort of red tourism, the media, through, at the centenary of the CCP a few years ago. I mean, there were all these movies, various celebrations, various revolutionary locations. I don't know if any of us has been to Mao's hometown in Shaoshan and Hunan, but I had actually gone to Changsha to to study company there, and I said, I would love to actually go to Mao's Mao's hometown, and they thought I was a little strange to do this, but I'm like, okay, they're like, they're very good hosts, and they gave me a car and sent me on my way there. And I'm someone who's very interested in history. As Todd mentioned, my undergraduate degree is in history. Actually, my first PhD program I was in that I didn't fit me very well was in history as well. And I'd been to Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's home in the U.S., and Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's home. And those are not like tourist places, really. I mean, there are some like nerdy people that go there, and they're not sort of super crowded. But so anyways, when the company Broad Air was the name of the company, sent me there, and they seemed like it was a little strange. I thought this was what I was expecting. And it was not that. It was actually more like Graceland. If any of you've been to Graceland, which is sort of Elvis's, it was totally packed with lines to get in his house, markets, people selling stuff all over the place. I actually bought a little Mao statue for myself, which is in my office in Cambridge. There. But anyway, so it is like, yeah, so anyway, so there is a lot of this sort of intergenerational socialization process that occurs that, I was giving a talk it's another place, and so someone commented during the conversation, someone had actually disagreed with me that even though that they had taken these classes, they didn't believe in them, and some other audience member kindly mentioned, like when there's this metaphor, if you're a fish, you don't know what water is exactly, because it's sort of your overarching context, and similar to sort of growing up into religion or whatever, it's hard to actually know what the effects are. So this is why one of the reasons why some of the results I'll show you, we are interested in doing quantitative research around this, because people will tell you whatever. I mean, they'll tell you what's socially appropriate. Maybe they'll tell you what they truly believe, but actually what they truly believe, they may not actually remember well. And I think that actually, it is important to have deep qualitative interviews and use historical records, no doubt. But I think that also using quantitative methods are important too, to try to get at some of these underlying issues that people may not self-report, or because of the social desirability issues. Okay, so also institutions. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip on this, but there are a variety of institutions from even sort of the reform period, the reform and opening, that everyone in the West, of course, knows about, because it's about sort of opening the markets. So that was actually one of two sort of basic points that Deng put forth in the late 70s and early 80s. The other was, a set of 4 different issues around sort of following Mao, the CCP as the sort of leading force in the society and economy. And so there's a lot of still maintenance of Mao. And we can go into that more if you want the questions. Okay, and I think this is even more important nowadays, because Xi Jinping is in many ways drawing on a number of the ideas and strategies of Mao in his governance. So we can talk about that in the discussion in more detail. And just to be clear, I think there's a lot of sort of knee-jerk comparisons between Xi and Mao, and I'm not saying necessarily that Xi is Mao 2.0, but what I'm saying is that actually by sort of understanding Mao, we can more, and his ideas and some of his strategies, it actually helps understand how the CCP is run, and actually some of Xi's ideas and strategies. A little bit on the research methods and data. So I mentioned, we do a mix of quantitative and qualitative work. So there are surveys of entrepreneurs that the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and a variety of other institutions have done, of thousands of entrepreneurs dating back to the 1990s. Publicly traded firms, the China's stock markets, Shanghai Shenzhen opened in the early 90s. There is tons of data on those firms. Also, you can content analyze through sort of scraping the text of those annual reports. We hand coded, so that's manually collect from the resumes of politicians at the city and provincial level, their basically career history. We did a bunch of interviews, actually. This, unfortunately, COVID got in the way of some of this, and some we did remotely. But I during the 10 years have interviewed, I think, about 400 people across the different studies that I've done. I mean, we did about a little over 30 specifically on the topic of this book. The book someone I saw has there's actually the interview questionnaire we actually included in the appendix. There's actually People's Daily has also online. You can search and content analyze the online text of the People's Daily, as well as each of the provincial dailies. So those are actually on text. So that also Peking University has a urban entrepreneurship study, which we also draw on. So this is in general the methods or the data that we draw on, and I'll say a little bit more about the methods as we go through the text. Okay, so the book is organized in 3 parts. The first part, we have sort of unpacking a variety of Mao's ideological points, principles, and his military principles. This is something, I mean, it's interesting that really resonates surprising amount in the West, is actually the use of Mao's military strategies in business. We can talk about some of those, sort of very interesting, and I think those are pretty insightful. Mass campaigns. So there is greatly, there's lots of campaigns. I mean, this is something that I think that is also where Xi Jinping is drawing on a lot of sort of Mao's governance techniques around, sort of concentrate efforts to do big things on like semiconductors or other, sort of even the People's War Against COVID, I think is like a campaign-oriented, governance strategy. And so this was, from throughout Mao's time, from Yan'an rectification to a variety of big campaigns. The ones we're going to particularly look at are the Great Leap Forward. Well, actually, I'll say what those are in a second. And then finally, we look at the social institutions. So things like, state ownership of the economy. Actually, the organizational structure of the Chinese state is actually very interesting in how it differs from the Soviet Union, and other issues like party branches. This is something that's in the news. They're also sometimes referred to as cells. Sort of Communist Party cells that are since 2017 have been increasingly required in local companies as well as multinationals. This is the things that hit the news, like when HSBC or Goldman Sachs, it's reported that there's a Communist Party branch within their thing. So anyway, so we're going to look at Mao's. We're going to particularly nationalism, frugality, and devotion, and then a variety of military strategies. The red is what, well, I'll talk a little bit more in detail. The other things are just for your information. If you buy the book, that's great. I'll probably say, my publisher is probably not very happy with me because I'm actually much more interested in giving books away and giving talks for free. And so, I'm just interested in talking about these ideas. So anyways, I'll probably send you one if you send me an email. So, anyway, so the mass campaigns that I mentioned, so the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, obviously, I think the two most well-known. I haven't read it yet. I don't know if it's actually out, but you've seen recently, perhaps there's a book by a Guardian journalist that has documented people's memories and lasting effect of the Cultural Revolution. It's getting reviewed in a bunch of places, so I think it will be a big hit. From what I've read, it's very consistent in some ways about this lasting legacy of the Cultural Revolution on China today. And also the Third Front Construction, which is an interesting campaign that Mao had, particularly, after the break of the Soviet Union. There was, in some ways, enemies on both sides. Obviously the ocean is on the eastern coast, but I mean, actually the U.S. could, perhaps invade through that way. So Mao actually located a lot of heavy military and heavy industry in inland and hard to locate places. And this has actually left an interesting legacy in those places. Well, I can talk about that some in the Q&A. I'm not going to be talking about that well, you can get the book, or send me an email and I'll send you that part. Then the socialist institutions, I think I've already mentioned. Okay, so I'm really behind in talking. Okay, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we do in the in our analyses. So this first part, looking at the ideology and the military principles. So we look at these different principles of Mao, which we've sort of gleaned from a variety of different sources, including obviously the original text, and then sort of different interpretations of what sort of the key strands are. Ren Zhengfei is a famous example of sort of a business leader who is ardently dedicated to Mao and Maoism. Here is some quotes. I mean, I always thought it was sort of interesting. Huawei is again in the news. I think the U.S. is going to prevent a number of technologies for being used from Huawei. 10, 15 years ago, there was all this debate, and even still today, you hear about it from U.S. politicians, that there's a variety, that Huawei is state-owned. Well, to my understanding, Huawei is actually not state-owned. It's actually, somehow there's some common owner, shareholding among the employees. But to me, that's sort of always a red herring, so to speak, because if you have a leader that's saying that basically he is dedicated to the CCP, he'll follow what the CCP says. He's a deep student of Mao. I mean, does it matter who the owner, what the ownership of the company is? So anyway, so Ren Zhengfei is a sort of a well-known example. We can tell you. Sorry, I don't have much time to go into the details, more details on him. Okay, here's a little bit about sort of Mao and nationalism. I mean, these are some of his, China standing up, sort of this, great rejuvenation, sort of recovering from, the century of humiliation. I mean, I think this was the, in some ways, rallying cry for why a lot of people ended up, a lot of rural Chinese and others getting behind the CCP. We discussed this more in the, so anyway, so we're interested in looking then, okay, so how is there a lasting influence of nationalism on Chinese entrepreneurs? In some ways, this, you would think, potentially would be a negative effect, or negative economic effect, because they would then sort of sacrifice potential profits and revenue because they could get sort of additional markets or maybe even get investors otherwise. And so this is just very simply from the people that we interviewed. And you can see this is sort of word counts from the interviews. So the folks that have joined the CCP, that have gone through the socialization and still sort of even after you're admitted to CCP, as many people here might know a lot better than I do, there's still a variety of meetings and now WeChat groups and the Shuixi Qiangguo app that you have to do. So yeah, here's some quotes. So this is just sort of in some ways almost descriptive type evidence that there is this difference from these folks that have gone through this socialization to be more and more likely to discuss these Maoist ideas of around which we're grouping together: nationalism, independence, autonomy, self-reliance. We also then look at these data on Chinese private entrepreneurs. Again, this is sort of data over 30 years, goes back to the 1990s, to examine, do these companies founded by these entrepreneurs that are CCP members, are they more likely to go abroad, more likely to accept foreign foreign investment? And there's people can look up these papers. These are with relatively rigorous statistical models. There's a lot of things beyond this line here that you could think about, like, well, maybe if they're CCP members, they have a lot more opportunities domestically, so they would need to go global as sort of an alternative explanation. Those are all a variety of things that we end up either controlling for or sort of checking a robustness check. So basically, we have pretty robust findings around these people that were basically during Mao's period entered the CCP, much more likely to eschew internationalization of their firms. Let's skip that. Yeah, here is actually some of that evidence. I don't know if anyone does econometric work or statistics, statistical analyses in their research, but there's a technique called regression discontinuity where you look at the basic regression predictions from different groups. And so what we're looking at here are, so we're assuming that the people that end up joining the CCP have a propensity in some ways to be part of the CCP and to be communists, because another potential alternative explanation is that, oh, well, it's all about people that have interests in joining the party. So this is sort of evidence to, in some ways, show that potentially that alternative explanation is not correct. So what these plots basically mean is that if you enter, so this 18 and above means these are people that are 18 above in 1978. So after Mao died in 1976, and then Deng comes along, and actually there's a change in the CCP rhetoric and socialization. So these people then, it's a little bit counterintuitive to sort of understand, because they're 18 and above, were basically entered the CCP in Mao's period. And then this upper line is then the people who joined the CCP later, however, were too young to join. So this is sort of an example of how where we're able to show that being socialized during this Maoist period has a fundamental effect on the leaders' later business strategies. Okay. I mentioned we also have this data on Chinese public firms. And so we're able to, as I said, content analyze to see what kind of words are used in the reports, and then also the extent to which those firms are also internationalizing, and that's these results here. So, anyway, so I guess all these sort of boxes and charts and statistics, might not be that interesting, but I, felt that I should show it just to give you a sense that, we're not necessarily just sort of counting words from entrepreneurs' interviews, although that is important, but actually trying to dig in to some underlying behaviors that get expressed for these different groups. Nationalism, as you know, is on, last number of years has been on the rise. And so I think that sort of understanding this enduring nationalism in China is pretty important. Okay. I'll just say quickly, one of the things that I did not know as much about was Mao's military strategies. And there's a lot been written about this in a variety of sort of more popular outlets. I'll just highlight one, which has been used quite a bit. The surrounding cities from the countryside strategy, which, when Mao was an early military leader in the CCP, the Soviet Union had a very, very strong influence on this, both the organization of CCP, also the military strategies. And so orthodox Marxist-Leninism, which, the Soviet Union ended up following, and Stalin was really pushing the early CCP to use, is about organizing in cities, because that's where the industrial workers are. And so Marx in England, and this was sort of where this was the theory that he had, and it actually worked somewhat well in the Soviet Union. Mao's insight was that, well, China has a lot of peasants. They have a lot of people. We have a lot of people in the rural area. We don't have a lot of people in cities, in industry. So we should actually first take the rural areas, and then later on take the cities. And this was initially sort of scoffed at, but ended up being pretty important to the success of the CCP over the KMT. So a number of business folks now talk about this as a key strategy for them. Huawei, early on, they had a real tough time in the telecommunications market back in the 1980s against, like, there's companies called Alcatel, Lucent back then, and Ren Zhengfei, the founder and leader, says, we followed this. Pinduoduo, another company that also claims to, sort of follow the strategy in the cities, or tough competitors like JD and Alibaba. So anyway, so this is sort of another sort of part of that part of the book. Okay, here's the list of the strategies we look at. Okay. So the second part of the book then, and I'm going to pretty soon just I'll get to the very end or quickly, and then we can open up for questions and answers. As I mentioned, we look at Great Leap Forward, we look at Cultural Revolution, and the Third Front construction. Now I'll focus in more detail on the Great Leap Forward just to give you a sense of what we do. And yeah, the Cultural Revolution is interesting, I think, because there is an issue of in economics and political science, research that's shown that people that live through the Cultural Revolution have much lower sort of trust in the institutions and norms in China. I think that this new book by the Guardian journalist actually has flavors that I've just read, a few of the reviews. I haven't looked at the book myself. And it's interesting because, I mean, a big reason is that, obviously with the, the Red Guards, there was a lot of institutional violence during the Zedong movement. People were out in the, sort of rural areas, very difficult conditions. And we have to remember that Xi Jinping himself was, for 7 years, a sent down youth too. Anyway, so let me go into the Great Leap Forward a bit. I don't know if any of you know this company, Wanxiang, really very impressive Chinese company. It's a business-to-business company, so it's not as well known as many of the consumer-facing companies. But this Mr. Lu, Lu Guangqiu, who founded the company, had started this company sourcing automotive components, and ended up going on and buying basically all of his competitors. And he talks about really the Great Leap Forward and the very tragic, horrible famine that happened afterwards as being very influential. And I just want to sort of in the book, obviously, give a disclaimer that, I mean, this is a tragedy beyond tragedies in some ways, probably unprecedented for a leader to have such an effect, such a a really tragic effect on a population. Some estimates 40 million people ended up dying. So I no way want to discount that tragedy that occurred. However, what we're trying to study is that, okay, people who live through that, then what effect does that have on them? In economics, for instance, there's studies that look at actually people that live through the Depression, Great Depression. How do they end up going on and leading their organization in a variety of ways? And so the Great Leap Forward is an interesting context to sort of try to understand that. So we look at two different, I'm going to skip over this. This is information around the Great Famine, really, the tragedy that of starvation that occurred. Okay, so what we're going to look at is, okay, so these individuals that went through there, we discuss this very much as a very deep imprint of resource scarcity on them, and that this then sort of stays with them throughout. A number of Chinese entrepreneurs actually talk about this. We're going to try to actually study it in a little bit more rigorously. So one very sort of obvious way to think about this is that the companies would actually save. And I think that's, we do actually find that. What we also try to examine in some ways, also with the statistical data, is in many ways a type of creativity almost that living through experiences like that embody. So Mr. Lu of Wanxiang, actually had quotes of this, he and how he actually founded his company. He salvaged tractor parts for automotive components So this idea of sort of, seeing creatively how, you can take what you have at hand and actually make something useful with it. And that's actually a hard thing to study statistically or with data. So we're going to try to study that as well. And there's a variety of, case examples, which we try to illustrate through the book. Yeah, here's Mr. Leo from, okay. So very simply, this, so if you look at so again, these databases of thousands of companies, entrepreneurs that lived through the Great Leap Forward versus not. The Great Leap Forward ones, are more parsimonious, so to speak, in their spending. Okay. Okay. So anyway, so the how we end up trying to study this effect of, like taking tractor parts and turning them into, car parts is whether the extent to which the company has taken inward investment and then actually gone out. These are things that do seem a little connected, but actually are fundamentally different types of activities. Actually entering a new market with consumer products, et cetera, is a very different than actually sourcing venture capital for investment, for instance. So this is one of the, so we look at the extent to which, these entrepreneurs are able to transform inward bound foreign investment into outward bound foreign investment. So we find that there. Okay. Let me go again, sort of in the interest of time, skip over that. Great. So I'm going to say just two quick things about, in some ways, the institutions and structure that have lasted. Yeah. Even though I think you told me, said Mao was sort of would never engage with business people. I mean, he's this famous Mr. Rong Yiren was sort of well known for being a red capitalist. And even today, I mean, I think this cube here outside of Tencent's headquarters is, I mean, when I was reviewing the slides again today, it's been a while since I looked at them. I just, really cracks me up. Sort of follow your party, start a business. I mean, that's really, I think, encapsulates at least what we think in the West is a contradiction. Okay. So I'm going to say a little bit about party branches because these are areas that are in the news. So these are organizations within companies, within sort of all organizations. I mean, I think the law, and it's changed, so I may not have it exactly right. If someone knows the exact detail, please tell me. If there's over 3 party members in the organization, there should be a party branch for those individuals who are part of the party to, engage and talk. And some places they have separate rooms. I know, when I have Chinese universities I've visited, I've learned they actually have, party members that are faculty members actually are separated from party, the non-party member faculty through this. So, so you can imagine in many ways these are sort of would be detrimental to a company. They could be sort of seen as shadow or authority structures, potentially undermine the leadership of the company. We find though that actually there are a number of benefits, so to speak, from the employee standpoint. So if you think about clearly in China's economy, with the state and the CCP playing very strong roles, having closer ties to those institutions, would be a benefit. So this is some of the findings we have here. There's some data on government appropriation of profits, sort of above and beyond taxes, and actually, sorry, this is state ownership. So without state-owned firms are actually more likely to do that. Sorry, I want to actually get to the party branch. Okay, so here's the party branch. I'm sorry, I was talking about state ownership, and I want to skip that in the interest of time. Great. So party branch in control on the one side being negative, but then also there's a potential positive in that there is a variety of HR and government relations benefits that could actually be engaged in. So here's some from the FT, an article criticizing the HSBC. So I don't know if any of you have been to Alibaba headquarters, but I used to take students to China, between 2010 2020, I think 6 or 7 years. I took, first at Harvard, then at Cornell, students, and we would visit sort of Alibaba has this really nice exhibition center in Hangzhou, which we visited that same place. So that's not us with the CCP flag though. Okay, so actually, a lot we found is that actually these organizations with party branches, have a much more robust set of HR, sort of HR benefits for firms. And so what we discuss in the sort of the section of one of the chapters that we discuss party branches, that, obviously as a Western business leader, having organizations, groups within your firm, Communist Party branches or cells or units or whatever you want to call them, is an issue of concern. I think we also have to realize that this is part of the sort of broader political economy of China. And I think there, again, I talked initially about a lot of sort of, in some ways, wishful thinking around, the liberalization of the CCP. I think as well, there is very much a knee-jerk condemnation of anything, having to do with communism. And I guess this point here is that, I think we should try to actually understand and study the sort of political institutions from the grounds up, more so than sort of use our own biases. All right. So I think this is going to continue. I think that, we wrote the book before, the book was published in 2022, so it was done, there's some delays with COVID. But I think that, given the last, number of years under Xi Jinping, I think that even if Liu He says they're going to open for business at Davos, I think it's, going to continue on a more sort of hardline fashion. We close the book. The last chapter tries to sort of look forward. And if you're a business person, like, how do you think about doing business in China, given this system? Here are some of them, which, again, send me an email. I'm happy to send you a book. And then additionally, politically, even though our book is focused on, in the foreground, business, because we think that's sort of the more interesting test, because of, the sort of oil and water, component of mile and markets. There is, I think, important things to understand about the governance of China more broadly. So with that, I'm going to stop. Apologies for going a little bit over, but anyways.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you.